There we go. So people who don't know me, Bruce Calden, the VP of Consulting Services here at Claigan. I am talking about the Canadian Plastics Registry, and I'm going to provide the details and examples. So this is going to be recorded. So the recording should be available on our website by the end of the week. Anybody who registered will receive a copy of the slides, whether you want it or not. We'll be sending it to you. And that should happen the next day or two. So I'm going to talk about example products. We're going to use our make-believe imaginary company Deuces. And if these are one of your products, we've artificially rebranded. We're just using, for examples, the data inside of it is similar to what those products probably really do have. But we're just using them as examples so it can be tangible. We find it's a lot better to be tangible. So I'm going to talk about some example products. I'm going to talk about the Canadian Plastics Registry. I'm going to summarize it and deadline, where the deadline is. Then I'm going to talk about some scope questions. Producer, about your electronic equipment, about your packaging, your single-use plastics. And then we have a Claigan FAQ on our website. You can go there and it's got some answers. And I'll explain why we have that and why it exists as opposed to the government version, which doesn't exist at this point in time. We're also going to talk about the North American Product Classification System, the code system for plastics. They don't use the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 triangle stuff for this. They use different coding. It is the North American Product Classification System, but it's unique to Canada. And then we're going to talk about examples, simple and complex products, how you summarize the results, what do summary results look like, combining in your sales volume. Earlier on, we're going to talk about your reporting categories and how it all gets categorized. And then we're going to have a little divergence. We're in Canada. Canada's PFAS reporting requirement just got announced 4 days ago. It is now the first one. So if you looking at the US TSCA reporting in May of 2025, Canada is earlier. It's January. It's also more encompassing. FDA regulated products are out of scope of the US PFAS reporting federally. They're not out of scope of the Canadian. So medical devices and food contact and all that are in scope of the Canadian PFAS reporting. January 2025. So your medical device manufacturer, and you basically everything in the state level has been pushed out, and you don't have federal level requirements. As we've warning a lot of our customers, Canada was going to include medical and likely be earlier, and it was earlier. So the last one to announce their reporting requirement, but theirs is first. And they're going to have Q&A. So there's a Q&A section up there in the control panel somewheres. And feel free to put whatever questions you want. We have tons of great questions this morning. And I'll try to get to as many as possible. And if I don't get to your question, feel free to reach out afterwards. Happy to help. This stuff is a bit complicated. I think our national motto for restricted materials legislation should be unnecessarily complicated. That theme is going to come up a lot. Again, we have these imaginary products. We've just rebranded so it can be tangible. A lot of consumer and professional monitoring control, some standard packaging. So we can be more specific when I'm talking about plastics and what's in what category, because they're not all reported together. All of these things are in scope, at least the plastics in them are in scope, but they're reported separately. So we have fictitious products or fictional products that we've created based, and then the data we're going to talk about is data similar enough products. We've muddied it up so you can't tell exactly the same. By the way, the tablet ones we're going to show part way, which we don't say what tablets they are, those are correct. So we're going to show some very accurate tablet data, 2 different tablets showing what the typical type of differences are. So Canada announced a registry. So by the way, whenever you see that bluish, purplish, underlined thingamadoo-jammy link in there when you get the slides, you'll be able to go to the actual registry. If you try to search the Canadian Plastics Registry online, you're going to get to this rambling page. Like it's almost all Canadian CEPA legislation have a rambling page for legal reasons. They have to have a page which talks about everything they ever thought about for this and every random and stray thought they've had and every proposal and draft. And it kind of wanders. And then you're going to see a proposed section 46 notice in December of last year. This is not this one. Then you can get to the real one, which is April of this year. That one is the mandatory one. And this link here will take you right to it and skip that rambling page. It's like you do the Canadian prohibition. It's a very rambling page. What's in scope? Plastic packaging, single-use disposable plastics, but a very specific list. So it isn't disposable catheters it's a very specific list of disposable plastics. Electrical equipment, which is categorized around the EU ROHS categories. More or less, if you're in scope of EU ROHS, you're in scope of this. If you're out of scope of EU ROHS, you're out of scope of this from an electronics point of view. The packaging's still in, but the electronic product isn't. And then in future years, agricultural products, textiles, automotive, construction, fishing. One of the new ones is fishing, very Canadian specific terms in here. When they talk about pot here, and people when they think about Canada and pot, they usually have one particular, fair conception. This is actually a pot is another name for a lobster trap. They'll also talk about trolling, which a lot of people know what trolling in this context means. But trolling, a lot of people think of social media, et cetera. Trolling here is sort of the act of laying out your fishing line behind the fishing boat. So the trolling materials are in scope of fishing. And then plastic resins, the actual powders, and so on and so forth. So the timelines is there are different requirements. We're going to focus mostly on these ones. These are the 2025, 2026, more or less can take care of itself. We're going to get to 2026 when it gets there. Right now, I'm focusing on today. And what you have to do today is for 2025. And we're looking at the requirements for plastic packaging, electronic electrical equipment, and single-use or disposable plastics, which have a 2025 requirement for the quantity of plastics in it. In future years, you're going to have to talk about, how much waste is generated, et cetera, of these. So that is 2026. 2025, we're looking at that. And then the other product categories start picking up in 2026, where tires and transportation, like cars and so on and so forth, and construction and fishing and textiles, et cetera, start having to report in 2026. So where this all comes from, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, CEPA, which is very large governing. By the way, some people ask questions in the Q&A, and please feel free to, about the legalese. And people get trapped in, when there's going to be, this is mandatory because it's in part 1 of the Gazette. No, the way it works out is CEPA is in part 3 of the Gazette, which means the regulation. As being a regulation in there, if a substance is added to Schedule 1, they can issue mandatory notices under Part 1. That's actually mandatory. Part 1 has mandatory notices. A lot of people get trapped in what's a regulation, what isn't. CEPA is allowed to create mandatory, as long as they follow rules, notices in Part 1 of the Gazette. And so Part 1 is perfectly valid and required. And I'll explain that again. Some people, a number of medical companies have gotten this completely backwards, not understanding the system. So really strange. If a substance gets into Schedule 1, it is not regulated. There's no restriction. It's really weird. The toxic substance in Canada has no restriction associated with it. A substance getting in there merely means it's approved for other chemical management, other risk management measures to occur. It has no restriction of its own. Where companies go, oh no, it's in CEPA Schedule 1. That means I have some kind of regulation. Nope, it's bureaucratic. It's a bureaucratic item that allows, and it's very important though, Environment Canada and Health Canada to do things. One of the things it can do is gather data. So they had to put plastic manufactured items. And you go to that link, you see all the toxic substance list. They needed to put plastic manufactured items, which is like electronic is a plastic manufactured item, even though it has other things in it, plastics in it. It allows them to do regulatory actions with it, mostly around data gathering. But it had to get on the list. And that's why in the toxic substance list in Canada, you have plastic manufactured items. It is completely a bureaucratic thing to allow them to do what we're going to talk about today. So it allows you to also Section 71 notices, which this is not. The PFAS reporting requirement is a Section 71 notice. So the January 2025 PFAS reporting requirement is under Section 71. It's in Part 1 of the Gazette, and some people go, well, it's not Part 2, it's not legally required. I'm like, yes, the notices are in Part 1 are legally required. It has to do with the powers of the minister inferred by CEPA, which is in Gazette Part 3. And I'm using a lot of words like Part 1 or Part 3 of the Gazette, and a lot of people is glossing over you. There's no, I can't think of any other legislative structure like this. It's really weird, it's Canadian. And again, our motto should be unnecessarily complicated. That's a hard follow, but this is mandatory, as is the PFAS reporting in January. It's mandatory if you're in scope of it. The Section 46 notice is what today is. The Canadian Plastics Registry is a mandatory Section 46 notice. Both of them are part of risk management measures where the minister, also funny thing, it's not Environment Canada or the department or ministry that asks you for it, it's the minister. Technicality, even though he may or may not have any idea what's in it, it comes from the minister. Maybe it's a British heritage thing, really weird legislation. So the Canadian Plastics Registry is the mandatory Section 46 notice. Now, there was a proposed draft one last December, and it was proposed, and the proposed one, it was like a notice of a notice. It wasn't mandatory. The notice in April, Section 46 notice, is mandatory. So people try to argue, well, it's not in part 2. It's not a regulation. I'm like, no, it's not. It's a notice. Notices are in part 1. They're empowered by being on Schedule 1 here, and then SEPA is a part 3 Gazette regulation. And I'll be like, do I have to do it? Yes, you have to do it. It's mandatory if you're in scope. So what we're going to talk about today is this one. So this is, and if you US TSCA, they're also cryptically odd too. So they're all because this isn't Parliament, or in the US, like the House and the Senate, they're not passing new laws. That's not what this is. This is a previously passed regulation that empowers Environment Canada, Environment and Climate Change Canada, ECCC. I'm just going to call them Environment Canada because I don't like change for big, long, complicated names. I'm just going to call them Environment Canada, but they're technically Environment and Climate Change Canada. Environment Canada and Health Canada are empowered through this regulation to do things, risk management measures, which these risk management measures can include data gathering. And that's what these notices are, mandatory data gathering under this. And we're going to talk about the Canadian Plastics Registry part of it. I am going to have a little divergence later on, talk about the mandatory PFAS reporting. So I thought, hey, I don't have to do my PFAS reporting until May, and I'm just going to let it slide for a while. The reporting now is January for Canada, and everybody's in. And it's a little different. It's similar to the US TSCA, the fact the way it's categorized and when it's summarized is virtually identical, but different. So you have to know, you're looking again, do you have PTFE in your products? In this case, is how much PTFE, not how many products. And then what is your function code? And like TSCA, you have to know your PTFE function codes. They're just inconveniently different than the US ones. They have their own function code. It's exciting. Anyways, I'm going to talk about that briefly. Back to the Canadian Plastics Registry. So I'm going to focus on 2025. 2026 is another year. Plastic packaging is in scope. A very specific list of single-use or disposable plastics. Like the taco bowls we had at our lunch and learn. We have internal educations, a lot of fun. This time was about our quality system on Tuesday. And we had taco bowls and like all paper, virtually all paper, waterproof, disposable foodware stuff. They're fluoro-coated. You can see the fluoroacrylics on them. Let's say make plastics, let's say make paper do the job of plastics, you fluoro-coat them. And that's what these are. And electronic equipment are in scope. So I'm going to talk about exactly what's in scope. And the deadline is September 29th, 2025 for products manufactured in, but for most of you, it's for imported into Canada. 2024. Again, people remind me, you can ask questions as you go. I'm going to get to them all at the end as best I can. There'll be some hand wavy. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention this. Somebody mentioned this morning. If we turn on closed caption, the new Zoom version is really good. Like I'm actually somewhat partially understandable. They even get some of the complicated terms. So if you turn on closed caption, you can actually sometimes make sense of what I'm saying, which my mother would probably appreciate that for most of my life. But you can actually turn on closed caption or whatever it is, and you can actually see it. There's actually a translation function, I think, too. I'm not sure how that would turn out. Kind of neat thing, a little divergence. Like myself, like my kids, we actually grow up in school. Our school is French until later high school. I still speak English a lot better than I speak French, which is still kind of borderline. But we actually all grow up being educated in French. So 2026 is going to be other things like transportation, construction, textiles. My favorite one is tires. I'm just like, hey, you have to report the plastics and tires. And everybody say, oh, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, except for we're going to go into this section later that synthetic rubber is not reportable. So what are tires reporting? Somebody, a really smart fellow this morning, had a really good point. Well, they can report the Kevlar belts inside them. True, but the rubber is not included. And I'll show you why later. Yeah, it's a bit of a muff up. Who's responsible? Who has to do this? The brand owner. So Canada's kind of weird. So when you look at Europe, you're looking at the importer, and Canada, you're generally looking at the importer. US looking at the importer. Canada, it's brand owner. Retailers are very powerful here, so they've managed to move things more to the brand owner. So the brand owner is located in Canada. And by the way, this is a simplification. I can go into deep detail. If anybody wants to go to the dirty rat hole, I've been down that rat hole. I can help. But simplified answer, it's the brand owner if located in Canada. And located in Canada means you have an entity that reports the Canadian Revenue Agency. And a lot of companies have bought and sold enough entities probably have one lying around if they're not already actively using it. But basically, do you have an entity that reports to the Canadian Revenue Agency? And if the brand owner is here, they're responsible irrespective of how the product got here. Now, sometimes it's not particularly fair, like somebody's making a complicated piece of test equipment and they bring in a Dell computer with it. I wouldn't really expect Dell to know the computer came in at that point in time. So there's some reasonableness to it, but fundamentally the brand owner is responsible. The brand owner can delegate, and that's a very long discussion, that if they can delegate it to their distributor, they can delegate it to a producer responsibility organization like Recycler, they can delegate it to a contract manufacturer who made the product, but the other one has to accept the delegation. The brand owner itself, in absence of everything else, is required to make sure it occurs. They can delegate it, but the entity, the delegatee has to accept it. If the brand owner doesn't exist in Canada, it's the importer of the product into Canada. So if the brand owner isn't here, it's the importer of the product. So that includes retailers, the people you buy, stuff overseas. If the brand you're buying isn't here, it's their problem, the retailer. So, by the way, we have an FAQ on our website because a lot of this is really complicated and unnecessarily complicated. Like examples, like products in parts 3 of 4 of Schedule 1 have to report items 1 through 4 of Schedule 5 and parts 6 and 8. Why don't you actually just say what they are? Because that'd be really easy. This choose your own adventure version of legislation is not as much fun. Well, it is. It's good for people like us because it talks backwards. Wait until you get to the PFAS regulation and like this whole section. These products are in scope, and you go, "Hey, I'm not one of those products." The next section says, "And everybody else." Then why did you bother splitting them up? But it's pretty funny. Is registration mandatory? Yes. Section 46 notices for the minister are mandatory for entities under scope. Because, well, it's a part 1 of the, that's not mandatory. Notices are in part 1. There's a knowledge gap here, but it's perfectly reasonable because CEPA, Canadian legislation and notices are not the simplest thing in the world. Are professional products in scope? Yes. Okay, this is where it gets really funky too. Electrical, electronic equipment, and packaging related to the residential waste stream is in scope, and electrical, electronic equipment, EE, and packaging related to the industrial, professional, institutional waste stream is in scope. So they're both in scope, but separately. You're like, what do you mean? Are they in scope or not? No, they're both in scope, but separately, which means you have to report them separately. So imagine you have professional laboratory equipment, monitoring control, and you have consumer monitoring control equipment. They get reported separately. They're both in, they just have a different reporting. Yeah. Do you report all your electronics together? Some point. Yes and no. All the plastics and the electronics are reported together by subcategory. And I'll show you some of the subcategories. Each subcategory is split up between consumer and professional. So, for example, electrical electronic equipment, they use all the EU ROHS categories. They use a lot of the EU ROHS rules like large scale industrial, fixed installation. Those guys are out of scope. So easy thing, if you're not in scope of EU ROHS, like you make a component or it's a repair part or it's large scale industrial, it's not in scope of this. Otherwise, you're in. And each of these categories report separately. So if you have IT equipment and control and monitoring equipment, they report separately, as do their professional and consumer versions. So we're just going to, the ones we have examples today, we made all monitoring control. And we're just going to say the multimeters are consumer, even though they can be argued being professional. We're going to separate them just for the initial section. Later on, we're going to merge them again. But that's a subcategory. If they also mean IT equipment, they're reported separately. The centrifuge in this picture could also be thrown under electrical tools. I don't think Canada would be too chuffed by the fact that you put centrifuge under monitoring control with all the rest of your products as long as it gets reported. But technically, you could also separate and put it under tools. Single-use disposable products are in scope, but they're very specific. They're like food serviceware, like the little capsule cups for coffee, the strange enough little bags you put your produce in that are not reusable. They're here. Personal hygiene products, toothbrushes, dental floss, razors, novelty items. Nobody knows what this category means. Tobacco and vaping products, fine. And single-use masks and gloves. If you do over 1 ton a year of single-use masks and gloves. By the way, every subcategory, it's over 1 ton, but it's 1 ton of the product. So, as I mentioned earlier, plastic products are the toxic chemical under Schedule 1. It's a bureaucratic thing. Therefore, if you have over 1 ton of electronic and electrical monitoring instruments, not their plastic, the instruments themselves, you're in scope and have to report a plastic. So it's against 1 ton limit per subcategory, but it's for the entire product. It's for the whole product, not just the plastic bins, which maybe are 15% of the weight of that thing. It's the weight of the whole product. You're over a ton, you're in. You're over a ton of packaging, which actually isn't very hard, believe it or not, then you're in. So what do you have to report? That your information is certify your information is true. Awesome. Your business identity and address. Okay. And then per subcategory, like professional monitoring and control, if you're over 1 ton a year of that product subcategory, for each plastic resin in it, and I'll show examples later. I'm like, this is a little hard to keep track of. But for monitoring control, professional monitoring control, for each plastic in your product, you have to report the identity of each resin using the Canadian specific, unique, unnecessarily complicated NAPCS code. This is Canada code. It's brand new. Nobody else uses it. It's not the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 you're used to. Yeah, it's different. The source of the resin, whether it's virgin, recycled, etc., almost all will be virgin. The total quantity of each resin in kilograms, which is the main reporting item, and the method used to quantify the above. And we'll talk about method 1 and 2 in this webinar. But I'll show real examples later. So it's the high level. So this is the NAPCS codes, also called the ASML variant codes. The top half are thermoplastics, which is generally seen as recyclable because you can remelt them. It isn't necessarily true, but generally seen as recyclable. The bottom half are thermoset. Once you set them, that's the way they are. You're not remelting them into something else. And the epoxy in your circuit boards are thermoset resins, for a good example. So good example in electronics, the faceplate of that electrical outlet is polyethylene terephthalate, PET, polyester. This one is a different polyester. It's polybutyl terephthalate, not polyethylene. It's probably maybe be the second or third most common connector material is PBT, polybutyl terephthalate, which is another thermoplastic polyester. Nylon, very common connector right there. PTFE, by the way, is recyclable at high temperature. You can remelt it. So PTFE wire, for anything else it's blamed of, is actually quite recyclable. And your epoxies, your circuit board epoxy, are not recyclable. And those are other thermoset resins, and that's the circuit board. So that's a good example of the different types of plastics. You report the amount of kilograms of each one of these by subcategory. You're not reporting centrifuges, you're not reporting ion chromatography equipment, you're not reporting the multimeters, you're reporting professional control and monitoring polyester terephthalate resins, how many kilograms in 2024. So rubbers are not in scope. I don't think they figured this out. This is a really weird one for car tires because synthetic rubber is not in scope of that list. It's not a plastic resin. So if car tires don't report in 2026, what are they reporting other than maybe the Kevlar belts? Because synthetic rubber is not in. So neither is silicone rubber or any of the other elastomers or that. Plastics are in, rubbers are not based on the rules. They might make some guidance saying, oopsie, yeah, report synthetic rubber this way, but it's not. Also out of scope are metals, ceramic, glass, and paper, other non-plastics. So now the example company Deuces. So what would Deuces have, this fake fictitious company we made up? They have to report flexible packaging. By the way, your packaging has 2 subcategories, flexible and rigid. So your flexible packaging, like your poly bags or the overwrap of your pallets. The pallet itself is reusable, but the overwrap normally is not. Your rigid packaging, like that bottle. So the difference between flexible and rigid is actually, does the packaging change shape when you fill it or empty it? So when you fill a poly bag, it changes shape, or when you put the wrap around your pallet or take it off, it changes shape. But the bottle, whether it's full or not, is the same shape. And that's the difference between flexible and rigid. It's whether or not, not that you can bend it, that's not the rule. The rule does it keep the same shape when you fill or empty it? So the toothbrushes one we had earlier, we have that plastic front and the paper backing. The paper obviously is not in. The plastic front does not change shape when you take pens in and out of it. So that front, even though it's really flexible on that toothbrush container, is very flexible, it's rigid because it does not change shape when you take the toothbrushes out. And that's the difference between flexible and rigid. And then we're going to say for the moment the multimeter is a consumer, or arguably not, but we'll say the consumer monitoring control. So they get reported. And then the professional monitoring control, and I'm saying the centrifuges are reportable under monitoring control, even though under a tool, you can put under tools too. But I don't think I'd be bothered by that. And so you have to report the plastics by weight here for the rigid, the consumer, and the professional. There are 4 separate submissions in the system as it's written today. Does the system exist today? No. But when it does exist, it's 4 separate submissions. So one of the differences, this will have its own portal, as opposed to PFAS reporting, which will also have its own portal, but it actually has the PFAS reporting in January 2025 will have an Excel sheet you can submit. This won't have anything like that, or it doesn't at this point in time. Won't. So what does it actually look like? And when you do the reporting, what does it look like? So we first do it at a product level. We do what is an individual product, and I'll explain how it's done in a bit. But this is, we'll say the test equipment, we'll say it's an ion chromatography device, whichever, what the product is. And here is the amount of grams of each plastic in that device. And the first 96 grams of polyester, which is polyethylene terephthalate, 3 grams of polybutyl terephthalate, which seems a bit low for electronics, 30 grams low density polyethylene, 45 grams of other polyethylene resins, which is normally polyolefins. It's like your heat shrink, even though heat shrink won't add up to that amount of weight. So there's got to be some other polyethylene blend. 33 grams of polystyrene, 76 grams of ABS, 432 grams of PVC, which would be heavily on the wires and cables, 978 grams of polypropylene, 364 grams of nylons, which will both be connectors, so probably something structural, and then 1,593 grams of all other thermoplastic resins, which will be some PFAS, but it will generally be polycarbonate. That's actually polycarbonates. PTFE and polycarbonate are actually in the same category. Other thermoset polyurethane resins, often polyurethane foam, and not very recyclable material. And then this is saying very low circuit board, 13 grams of other thermoset resin. I would suggest it's much higher normally in this kind of product. But the other thermoset resin is the epoxy you see in your circuit board. So that's pretty typical. Now, if you look at the centrifuge in the far right, we would say it has a lot more circuit boards. It has 260 grams of resin, or it could have some potted parts. So we do the individually, and then you see at the very top, or second from the top, you can see number of units sold. And that number of units sold is needed to aggregate the data, because this is just the data for a single product. You don't report, though, the grams per unit. You report the total amount of kilograms of polyester and other thermoplastic in each one of these rows for all of your professional control and monitoring as one total. So you need your volumes and need to merge them all together. You also need the packaging, which you can see we have a bunch of packaging items here, which are different levels of polyethylene normally and other thermoplastics, high density and low density polyethylene. We also have 2 caveat placeholder columns, pallet overwrap, because the pallets are not in scope, but the overwrap is. And so we have the average amount of low density polyethylene in, say, a pallet, and we can modify this around depending what the way you're set up. And it's this way you can say how many pallets you send in, just to pick up theirs. And your components and repair parts and spare parts are not in scope of reporting themselves, but the packaging is. So we create a miscellaneous column of packaging for jetsam and flotsam. So when you look at what you sold in Canada, you probably have this tail of spare parts and repair parts and this, that, and the other thing. We just have you just throw those into one bucket. So we make sure we get the packaging in. It's just so all of your random and miscellaneous packaging gets included. This is all packaging stuff. So you're looking at, here's the acrylic bottle. We're saying 155 are other thermoplastic resins, which is probably some kind of polycarbonate blend of all things. And the lid is probably low density polyethylene or vice versa. And then the pallet overwrap, that's our placeholder, say some couple hundred grams of low density polyethylene. So that's the adjustment we make for pallets, because they're overwraps in the scope. Then we have to aggregate, and you'll see there's a column for textiles. We're just showing it for interest because textiles are not reportable this year, but if you add textiles, they go there. And so this would be for professional control and monitoring. If for the sum of units we had sold in Canada, you have 585 kilograms of polyester, and then all these numbers math together. And this is actually what gets reported. This is the total weight actually doesn't really get reported, but it's summed. Everything above it gets summed. So this is actual report. You basically professional control and monitoring, 585 kilograms of polyester, 531 kilograms of other thermoplastic polyester resin, 162 kilograms of low density polyethylene. And you do that for the product and then for its packaging. And all your packaging merged together. So what you actually report is what's in there. You don't report centrifuges, you don't report multimeters, you report the sum. And for this one, we just threw the multimeters in with this. We're going to say, hey, multimeters are professional in this case, just to show the numbers. But this is all but merged together, which ends up being there's first a technical phase to get the declarations for represented products, and then there's a sort of an Excel phase to aggregate it. If we do the work for you, we just do it all for you and just let you put your volumes in, and everything gets calculated for you. So reporting in 2025. So this is how we handle it. So we can summarize the data you do have, which in packaging, you often have data, you might earn, and we can generate the data you don't have. So we can just summarize what you do have or generate the ones you don't. And I'll explain, and then create the declaration. For electronics, generally, we're summarizing the data. The data gathering from suppliers is virtually impossible, this level of complexity, and not worth it. I mean, we can do the multimeter in a couple hours in our facility or with our processes, as opposed to months and months of you trying to get data and not getting it all. The only piece of data that's quite different from one multimeter to the other is the outer housing, actually, usually. So we can generate and summarize the data. And so we can create it for even the most complex item. And we do it in a bunch of different ways. For simple products, like the multimeter, we use method 1. So there are three methods. The third one is not ready in the guidance. But method 1 is the specific component identification method, where we choose representative products. And we're not trying to do every multimeter. And I'll show you some of the rules we use for representative products. We're not trying to do every multimeter. We're trying to do something representative. Then we test the major plastics. And a lot of people are like, oh, whoa, testing, that's really expensive. No, we have like a factory. You hand a multimeter over, somebody's at 50 or 100 of these with a tool, which tells you which plastic it is right away. It's so much faster than data gathering. Like, oh, we can get that from our supplier. Sure, but before you finish your email, we'll have the answer for what the outer housing is made of. And by somebody who's done a million of this in a system that organizes it all for you. So it's just faster and cheaper. By the way, Claigan, one of our big focus is we look at the end product. What do you actually have to, what is your deliverable to the government? That thing. Okay, you need to read that reportable. What's the easiest way to get the report? This way. We like the most compliance for the least effort for you, which usually means the cheapest way to get the most compliance. So we end up giving companies way more compliant people for way less money, which may or may not be the best business idea for a service provider, but we never intended to be this big. We tend to be the best and do the best of what you need, what your product needs, what the output is, as opposed to what, shareholders or, wanting to go public or some IPO or something like that. That's not a company like your vendor wanting to IPO soon or similar is no way useful to you. So we test the major plastics, and for the dense things like the screen, which is, by the way, a whole bunch of layers of acrylics, and the circuit board and the cables, we have models for circuit boards. So we find the average circuit board, they actually average out to be roughly the same each time between the populated circuit board and all its connectors. So we have models for circuit boards and motors and pumps and fans and displays and cables, make it a lot easier. And then we generate the whole data for you. So the easy ones, like the outer housing, has a huge impact on the weights. Everything inside, the difference between one multimeter circuit board and the other, do not make large differences. They have this huge range of plastics for sure, but the actual differences in those huge range of plastics is not very large. It depends more of the size. And so we generate the data. And so that's how we do for simple. For complex, we use the average bill of materials method, where we choose representative products with you, and then we give you a questionnaire and saying, hey, if you know that, here are the answers. The main thing we're going to need to know, and I'll show you an example in a moment, is what are the weights of what are the plastics, the weights of the plastics that make up more than 50% of any one dimension. And if you don't know the weight, if you give us the dimensions, we have models for that. So then we use models for a product like this. For the large plastics, if you only know its size, not its weight, circuit boards, the motors, pumps, fans, and displays, cables, we ask questions like, how many cables do you have and roughly how long are they? And how many motors of this size? How many motors of this size? How many motors of this size? The counting exercise. We try to create an accounting exercise. Oh, we have 7 circuit boards. Cool. Here are the 4 circuit board size categories, which fit into which. Just fill in. And then we generate the product data. So the questionnaire has got a lot more on it. And the biggest differentiator from product to product is the big plastics. The circuit boards matter, but it matters more how many are their size. The composition doesn't actually change a lot. Use a lot of the same component manufacturers. You're going to be heavily epoxy in the main circuit board. The connectors are going to be nylon, polyester, PVT, and a few other materials. You're going to have very small, some wires in there, it's PVC mostly, some variation. You're going to have heat shrink, which is mostly incredibly low weight polyolefin, which is other polyethylene, et cetera. So the big plastics are very important. And then we also have packaging questions here. Like, do you have foam with your product? Awesome. we'll get the general, what the idea of the foam would be in there. How many poly bags do you have? That sort of thing. And we use that to generate it from a model. Now I'm going to show you real ones. The ones on the next page are not from questionnaire. They're real. They're type ones. So we did two major tablets, two major manufacturers of tablets. The declarations, everything that's complicated is almost identical. The only difference is the major plastic. So they're roughly the same size, so the same number of circuit boards, same number of wiring. Turns out, two totally different manufacturers, the innards are roughly the same plastics, even though the designs are quite different. The difference is the outer houses. It's often how much polycarbonate's involved. And so that's very different. So all their internal bits, you're looking at 11 grams versus 10 grams of polyester, 3 grams of PBT versus 4 grams, 31 grams of epoxy versus 30 grams. They're virtually identical. What's actually the biggest difference is the outer housing, the polycarbonate. These are real tablets, actually. So why do we do it this way? Simple products, we use method 1. The advantage is it's the most accurate and preferred by the Canadian government. It's the fastest. We're like, well, testing would take forever. This multimeter is like half a day. We're giving it to somebody who's done 50 to 100 of these with a process to follow it, every tool he needs, because he's done so many. It's so much faster. And it's the lowest effort by you. You just hand it over, we'll take care of it. However, you might say, hey, my product is really expensive. I want to use the average bill of materials method. Awesome, but it's gonna be a lot more effort by you because we need to know the major plastics. You know, send us the major plastics, we just weigh it. These cost the exact same. Everybody's like, well, testing should be way more expensive. No, giving the product to somebody who has a process to follow, who's done it 50 to 100 times, is so much easier than hand-holding somebody through filling out a semi-complex questionnaire. However, you don't have to ship a product or spend the effort on the product. And it's still inordinately faster than data gathering because you'd have to do all those weights anyways. No matter how you try to get supplier information, good luck finding a model to get information from them, trying to be complete, and you're going to end up having to redo all the weights anyways and get all the weights yourself anyways. We just need the weights and a count of fans and pumps and stuff like that. Or we can take a picture of the inside and we can do the count, which we do for lots of other things, and create the model. And once everything gets blended together, the little tiny difference is a little bit of nylon versus polyester, and the product just gets completely blended out. And realistically, a lot of them are glass filled, so are not really recyclable the way they are anyways. So it's two different ways. And so with a project, you can pick and choose. Literally, when we quote it, somebody comes and, hey, can you just do my product line? Don't worry about figuring out what products. We'll make a recommendation and go back and forth with you. And there'll be a cost. And like, is this the tested or to the questionnaire? Same cost, whichever's easier for you. We make this really easy. We do lots of it. We have a process. Sending the product to us is the easiest for everybody. However, you might not want to do that. Also fine. You're like, well, I have all this data gathering. Sure, good luck with that. Or we can just solve it for you. And the nice thing about this, it's not like you have to redo this every year. You might adjust it in a year or two. And there's some more information you need. Once you get the models going, it's just applying sales volumes year over year. So we suggest doing the most accurate and move on to other things. This is really good. We're also the best in the world at this. This is our thing. We just make it easy for you. Or you can make it hard for yourself. That's also fair. I'm not going to stop you, but we can definitely help you. Plastics registry. So phase 1, what we do with the client is you provide us what data you do have. You might have stuff on packaging, which means often either providing us the product or completing a questionnaire. Phase 2, we generate the product declaration. So we do things at the representative product level. Here's what one product looks like. We summarize the data you have and generate the data you don't have. I'm not sure which data I do and don't have. Don't worry, we'll take care of it. Then we need your sales data, which only you can provide, Canadian sales data. And then we create an amalgamated submission and we help with your submissions, support your submission. Now, some companies like, can you do the submission for us? Yes, but you don't want that. You're going to want to own the GC code and the password. However, what we do is we web meeting with you and just sit over your shoulder. And if you do it yourself, awesome. But the Canadian ones are often unnecessarily complicated. And almost always we end up having a web meeting in because the buttons don't make any sense and the fields don't make a lot of sense. We'll give you exactly what to enter, but then you'll get there and going, what is going on? I'm like, yeah, unnecessarily complicated. The section 71 is the PFAS reporting. It'll have an Excel sheet we can fill out, give to you, and you can submit. Sweet. This one doesn't have that. You actually have to put it into the portal. In the future, it might have its own file, but right now it's the portal only. Rule of thumb, represented products. Like, do we have to do all my products? For each product line, we usually choose 3 represented products for each product line to get the variations. However, if they're really just variations of each other, like I make centrifuge, and they're all just different sizes centrifuge. 1 is fine, especially for big complex products, and we can scale it a little bit by size. So for big complicated things, 1's usually fine. But if you make different coffee makers, and you have 2 cup and 4 cup and all these different types, we usually do 3 max. You want to cover at least 50% of your product volume that way. And then we use that data as representative for all the related products. So basically, instead of, we have this kind of multimeter and we have that kind of multimeter, they're quite different. Let's just do those 2, which is not the 3, but they really do represent everything. And the multimeter, create the ones for those 2 multimeters and then apply it to all multimeters. And if there's an incredible weight difference, we'll scale the numbers, but that's the worst you have to do. Then you have to keep records of the data. In year 1 and year 2, it's more trust-based. In year 3, there's more audit-like requirements. And if you're a recycler, there's mandatory audit requirements. If you're a manufacturer, they have the ability, the government can ask you much more audit-like questions. So, because we're an ISO certified lab, so everything for us is detailed data, due diligence oriented. We have a history of everything you could ever imagine in our system. So we're really good that way. So again, reporting in 2025, we can summarize the data you have and generate the data you don't have. Furthermore, for generally for electronics and complicated things, we can generate and summarize the data, make your life much easier. I think our CF is fairly limited time frame. And a lot of people postpone it to the last minute, which is not advisable. It's a lot easier when the clock is not ticking. But then again, sometimes it's much easier to get money approved when the clock is ticking. And then we can summarize it. We give you the answer. This is what you're going to submit. And we'll also give you, all the bits, most of the bits of how the sausage was made, not necessarily the models, but all the individual product stuff. And so you can play around with the numbers too. It's just Excel. And it gives you a huge jump on year 2 on just modifying them. And then we can create the summary be submitted. Now, while we're doing that, this is reporting plastics. One of these plastics, in the middle row, all other thermoplastic resins includes many fluoropolymers. PFAS reporting is just 1 polymer. And it's easy to do PFAS reporting at the same time because this is all polymers as opposed to fluoros, which are single polymer. Which reminds me, as released July 27th, a long time ago, 4 days ago, PFAS reporting is due federally in Canada January 29th. You go to the hyperlink to see it in all its glory. And like all of them, it's unnecessarily complicated. You can have a read through it saying, hey, my products aren't in section 2. I know, go to section 3. What the hell? Section 3 says, section 2 says all these product types are in scope. And you go, well, I'm not in that. Section 3 goes, and all the other ones. I don't know why, unnecessarily complicated, but everybody's in scope. And unlike the US, there isn't a separation between EPA and FDA. Health Canada and Environment Canada are both in CEPA. So medical devices are in scope of the January 29th PFAS reporting deadline. Now you have to have over 100 kilograms of PFAS. So it's not products, it's PFAS for PFAS, but everybody's in scope. Aerospace, automotive, electronics, medical devices, everybody. Professional, industrial, medical, everybody's in. And I probably have a webinar in a couple of weeks of this, maybe in 3 weeks, and explain all of this joy. And so it's very similar to the US one, but everything's rejiggered in a different way. The output's just different. Otherwise, very similar. It's got a little bit of other caveats, if then, buts. It's also got a specific positive list of PFAS, which misses 2 of the most common PFAS, which is really weird. It's got almost every esoteric PFAS, plus PTFE and PVDF and FCAM, but it doesn't have FFCAM and it doesn't have fluoroacrylics, which since they're mandatory reporting, like one section's for textiles and bedding, which exclusively only use fluoroacrylics for PFAS, but the fluoroacrylics are not in, is kind of a big miss. So there might be some tinkering with it. It's not their best activity I've ever seen, but it's mandatory. And everybody selling to Canada, you have to be over 100 kilograms of PFAS. So you have to figure out your PFAS first and whether you're over 100 kilograms. And PTFE does add up very quickly. Fluoroacrylics do not, very light, and may or may not be in scope. But PTFE adds up pretty fast, especially in antennas and stuff. Medical devices, PTFE is everywhere. And it's 100 kilograms of all your products. So it usually adds up pretty fast. Okay, so again, phase 1 for us is once we quote you, and for quoting really easy, it's like you can know what products you want to do, or basically come to us and go, what do you suggest? And go, well, here you go. This is exactly what we suggest for you. We'll create it for you. And we'll get back to you tomorrow or 2 days from now and tell you exactly what to do. We're doing. And then we work with you, modify it, and you know exact costs. And so even if you don't go with us, you know what the cost you have to set aside to do these kind of things. And we'll talk about the timeline. So you provide available data, which you can give us the product, and it's easy, or you can complete the questionnaire. So once we've started the project, it's just provide a product or complete questionnaires, or you might do it, hey, I have six represented products, you give us 3 and you complete the questionnaire of the other 3. All fine. Phase 2, we generate the product declaration. We summarize the data you have and generate the data you don't have. Phase 3, we need your sales data, and then we amalgamate it and support your submission. It's integrated. And again, when out, just reach out to info@claigan.com. Really cool. And we have the Claigan FAQ there and a Q&A. So there is something up in the control panel, if I can find it again, where you can submit questions. I'll try to get to as many as possible. Oh, great question here. Has Canada published reporting template? No. It'll be a portal, not an Excel sheet. The section, so the PFAS one I talked about has an Excel template. This one does not. It describes, we have Excel templates because we have to do this all the time, but they don't. Oh, if we have PFAS testing performed through Claigan, we'll be able to use that data to fulfill the Canadian PFAS reporting? Yes, absolutely. It is. So whoever does the PFAS work with us, we actually give you 2 levels of declaration. We give you the final one for US TSCA, and then there's a middle ground working one because we expect the data to need to be re-manipulated for different jurisdictions. So anybody who's done PFAS work with us in the past, we actually structure, that's why you get 2 levels of deliverable. It's really sort of product specific one, and then the final output one. The product specific one is made so we can rejigger the data. So we can actually take the exact same data and we just have to re-manipulate it into the Canadian form. Would the brand owner be responsible even if they're not resident in Canada, but they're identified as the importer record? It's very hard to be the importer record unless you're resident in Canada. That'd be hard to do because legally the importer has to be Canadian. Or even if you're clearing customs, there is a Canadian one on it. So it'd be very odd if you're the importer of record and you don't have a Canadian location. And it's not some technicalities, but you have to have a Canadian entity to be responsible. It doesn't mean you can't still find a way to do it, but the responsible entity is the brand owner if in Canada, otherwise it's the importer. And realistically, you usually, if you submit into the system using a Canadian address, they'll normally accept it. When reporting plastics, will I be able to upload a spreadsheet or PDF file, or will there be a drop-down list to pick from each plastic and use in my represented product? We don't know yet. I mean, it'd be really cool if they had like a spreadsheet to upload, and the PFAS Section 71 does. The Section 46 doesn't at this point in time. That could also change. It'll be a portal. From previous Canadian things, it's usually going to be a interactive PDF. It could be HTML, which would be the worst. They haven't actually published it yet. It'd be nice if there's a template to fill in. There is for the PFAS reporting. There isn't right now from the Plastics Registry. The Fledgling Plastic Registry states for the first 2 years, producers will be able to self-verify, and for the third year, 4 will have to be verified by an accredited third party. That's actually not what it says. That's in the PRO. That's in the Producer Responsibility Organization section. So if you have a recycler reporting for you, which you can delegate, by the way, the first 2 years they can just report. Year 3, the PROs have to be audited, but not the other third-party bodies, just the PROs at this point in time. If it requires to be audited, we definitely can, but at this point in time, it's only the producer responsive to recyclers that you delegate. So if you delegate, they have to be audited. You don't. Great question. Is the Canadian plastic regs similar to EU packaging and packaging waste reporting revisions? Single user and non-recyclable seem to be one common point. Not intentionally. And the difference between Europe and Canada fundamentally is in Europe, you have to pay money related to the volumes. Here it's just reporting. That might change over time. So, and the categories are different. Canada is resin specific with their own category. The individual countries are not necessarily as resin specific. They're often plastic versus paper. So there's similarity to the EU packaging directives. And in intent, they're very similar, except for in EU, you'd have to pay fees. It's producer responsibility. Here it's just reporting. And the plastic resin granularity is far greater in Canada than most European requirements. If we tested for plastics in 2024 for reporting purposes, can you use the data for future reporting as long as we adjust for sales volume? Absolutely, and any major product differences. You're going to have additional requirements in future years, but they're not really product specific. They're basically next year basically say, hey, you did these products. How much turns into waste at your facility? Well, none. We sell them. Okay, and then there's more and more data over time. So yes, when we sent you the structure, we recommend probably year 2 to tinker with it a bit, but it'd be tinkering, improving, but basically using the same models. Yeah. Is PFAS reporting 100 kilogram per year, or is the reporting for a multi-year like TOSCA report? I think both US and Canada are one-time events. And Canada can re-up every year, but right now it is this. So in the TOSCA, it's from 2011 to 2022. You have to report that entire time frame for PFAS. For Canada, for PFAS, it's just your 2023 volumes. For plastics registry, it's annual and every year. So the US and Canadian PFAS are both one-time events, the US one being a very large time sequence, 2011 to 2022, and the Canadian one just being 2023 for PFAS. Plastics registry is annual, the previous year. What is the cost for this page of services for a handheld monitor, for example? Feel free to reach out and give you specifically. It depends. Usually it's around $1,000. Could be less, could be more, but not a lot. It depends what it is. But generally, it's relatively inexpensive to do the represent a product model. If our products are out of scope for the plastic registry, because we fall under ROHS large scale industrial tool exclusion, do we need to report any raw packaging materials that we import, despite it being out of scope products? Yes, your packaging's still in scope if you're over 1 ton of rigid packaging or over 1 ton of flexible packaging. So your packaging's still in, independent of whether your product's in. So it could be electronics, it could be large scale fixed installation, it could be potato chips. Your packaging's in if you go over the 1 ton threshold of flexible packaging and or the 1 ton threshold of rigid packaging. Canada PFAS is 100 kilogram per year threshold reporting. Yes, mostly. Very complicated. So for Canadian PFAS reporting, you have to be over 100 kilograms. So I think I mentioned the last one of the of PFAS, and not any specific one, just combined. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's the easiest one to say, 100 kilograms of PFAS. Reporting threshold for plastics is 1 ton of plastic manufactured products. So 1 ton of a subcategory of electrical electronic equipment. So if you have professional control monitoring, it's 1 ton of professional control monitoring equipment, not the plastics in it. The plastic packaging is over 1 ton of rigid packaging and over 1 ton of flexible packaging. So it's 1 ton for plastics of the category, not the plastic itself, which in flexible plastic packaging will be usually be the plastic. But if you're making like those centrifuges, which are only about 15% plastic, it's the whole 100% of the centrifuge counts towards the 1 ton of plastic manufactured product. Because in SEPA section, SEPA Schedule 1, the hazardous substance is the plastic manufactured product. It's the centrifuge. So it's 1 ton of of control monitoring, which is centrifuges and the chromatograph test gear, whatever else is in that category. Which if you also make IT equipment, if you only bring in half a ton of IT equipment, it's not in. So it's the weight of the manufactured plastic product where you're looking. My centrifuge is pretty not plastic, but it counts as a plastic product. It's all bureaucratic because your centrifuge might be 15% weight plastic, if that, but it's still a plastic manufactured product. So cool. I didn't get your questions. Feel free to reach out. Oh, again, if you're registered or receive a copy of the slides, there will be a recording available on our website in the next day or two. Feel free to reach out. And if you've done work with you in PFAS before, it's amazingly how overlap. Oh, by the way, if you do your PFAS work or do your PFAS work, the plastics registry work is sitting there. It is a modification of our processes. So when we did PFAS, well, if we've done PFAS work for you, our process has always had the plastics registry in process. So it's an incremental cost. Like it's not like you have to start from scratch. Because for PFAS, we're looking at your fluoropolymers. For plastics registry, we're looking for all of your polymers. So when we're doing that, we actually pick up both data sets more or less. So it's really convenient to do PFAS and plastics registry with us at the same time. There's a lot of advantages. Perfect. And again, if you say, hey, I've got a lot of this data, but not all of it, is it cheaper? It can be sometimes. we can summarize the data you have and generate the data you don't have. And in every situation, we can do that, whether it's PFAS, whether it's plastic registry. Reach restrictions are a little different. Thou shall not have is a little different than reporting. But for all of these, if you have work done, we can leverage it, and then we can generate what you don't have. And it's pretty straightforward for us. Oh, perfect. And well, thanks much, Lee. And Gren, great pleasure hosting everyone. I look to talk to everyone again soon.